Sometimes, the people who change your life don't knock politely. They show up at your door carrying the weight of a world that's falling apart. The first night I moved into Building C at Maple Grove Apartments, I expected silence, cardboard boxes, and the familiar loneliness that always came with starting over. My tiny one-bedroom apartment smelled like fresh paint and unopened furniture, and every surface was covered with half-unpacked boxes labeled in messy black marker. After spending the last 6 hours dragging bookshelves, kitchen supplies, and too many boxes of things I probably should have thrown away years ago, I finally collapsed onto my couch with a microwave dinner balanced on my knee. Outside my window, a steady spring rain tapped softly against the glass while distant traffic hummed beyond the neighborhood. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt like a chance to begin again. Then, at exactly 11:47 p.m., someone knocked on my door. Not loudly, not desperately, just 3 careful knocks that somehow sounded heavier than they should have. I glanced through the peephole and froze. Standing across the hall was the tallest man I'd ever seen in person, wearing a dark rain jacket soaked from the storm. His sandy brown hair clung to his forehead, his tired blue eyes surrounded by the kind of exhaustion that sleep alone could never fix. Resting against his shoulder was a little boy wrapped in a dinosaur blanket, his cheeks flushed as he slept. The man looked like someone who had been carrying too much for far too long. I opened the door before I could talk myself out of it. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, almost embarrassed to exist. "I know we haven't officially met yet. My name is Ethan Brooks. I live across the hall." His voice was calm, polite, and carefully controlled, but underneath every word I could hear fatigue, the kind that settled into someone's bones. "I'm Noah Carter," I replied. "Is everything okay?" Ethan looked down at the little boy before answering. "This is my son, Lucas. He's running a fever tonight. His pediatrician called about a prescription that wasn't ready earlier, and the pharmacy a few blocks away says they'll stay open another 20 minutes if I can get there now." He hesitated, almost swallowing the rest of the sentence. Would you mind watching him for about 20 minutes? I hate asking someone I just met, but everyone else I know is either out of town or working night shifts." I looked at Lucas. Even asleep, his tiny hand was gripping his father's jacket like he was afraid of letting go. Something inside my chest tightened. I didn't know Ethan. I didn't know anything about him except the quiet sadness behind his eyes. Every sensible part of me said this was an unusual request, but another part of me saw a father who had clearly spent every ounce of himself taking care of his child. "Of course," I answered before overthinking it. Relief washed across Ethan's face so quickly that it almost hurt to witness. "Thank you," he whispered. "Really? Thank you." He carefully carried Lucas inside my apartment and tucked him onto the couch without waking him. Before leaving, Ethan gently brushed a strand of brown hair away from his son's forehead and smiled with a tenderness that transformed his exhausted face into something unexpectedly warm. "I'll be back as fast as I can, buddy," he murmured. Lucas never opened his eyes, but his small fingers reached instinctively toward where his father had been standing only seconds before. When the apartment door quietly closed behind Ethan, the room became strangely still. Rain continued tapping against the windows, while the little boy breathed softly beneath his dinosaur blanket. I had lived in that apartment for less than 6 hours, yet somehow it already felt like my life had quietly changed, even if I couldn't explain why. When Ethan returned 18 minutes later, his hair was still damp from the rain, but the tightness in his face had eased the moment he saw Lucas sleeping peacefully on my couch. He held up a small paper pharmacy bag with an apologetic smile. "They almost closed before I got there," he said quietly. "Thank you for helping us." I shrugged as if it had been nothing, although somehow those 18 minutes had felt strangely important. "He barely moved," I replied. "He slept the whole time." Ethan stepped closer and rested the back of his hand against Lucas's forehead with practiced gentleness before letting out a slow breath. "The fever feels a little lower already." He looked at me again, almost unsure how to accept kindness from someone he had only met minutes earlier. "I owe you one." "You do not owe me anything," I answered. "Neighbors are supposed to help each other." For a second, something softened behind his tired blue eyes, like he wanted to believe that was still true. He carefully lifted Lucas into his arms without waking him. The little boy automatically wrapped both arms around his father's neck and sighed in his sleep. Watching them together felt oddly personal, as if I had witnessed a quiet moment that belonged only to the two of them. Ethan thanked me one more time before disappearing across the hallway, and the apartment fell silent again. The next morning I woke earlier than usual because sunlight poured through my bedroom window. I carried another box toward the kitchen when I heard laughter outside. Curious, I glanced through the peephole. Ethan was kneeling beside Lucas in the hallway, helping him zip up a tiny blue backpack covered with cartoon rockets. Lucas looked much healthier than the night before. His cheeks had lost their redness, and he bounced excitedly from one foot to the other while Ethan reminded him not to forget his lunchbox. "What do we always say?" Ethan asked with a patient smile. Lucas grinned. "Be kind. Listen. Wash my hands." Ethan laughed softly. "And?" The little boy thought very hard before answering. "Come home to you." Ethan smiled in a way that was impossible to fake. "Exactly." I pretended to keep unpacking, but somehow I found myself watching until they disappeared down the stairs. Over the next several days I noticed little things without trying. Every weekday morning, Ethan left with Lucas before 7:30. Every evening they returned carrying grocery bags, backpacks, or library books. Sometimes Ethan looked exhausted enough to fall asleep standing up, yet he always crouched to Lucas's height whenever the boy wanted to tell him about school. One afternoon, I was struggling to carry a heavy bookshelf from my car when someone grabbed the other end before I even realized they were there. "Lift from your knees," Ethan said with an easy smile. Together we carried it upstairs without much effort. "Thank you," I said, wiping sweat from my forehead. I was about to lose that battle. "You probably would have one eventually," he replied. "It just would have taken another hour." We both laughed. It was the first time I had seen him laugh without forcing it. As we set the bookshelf inside my apartment, Lucas wandered in behind his father, holding a sheet of construction paper covered in colorful crayon drawings. He looked up at me with complete confidence, as though we had known each other far longer than a few days. "Hi, Mr. Noah," he said proudly. "I drew a dinosaur that eats broccoli because my teacher says vegetables make everything stronger." I accepted the drawing like it belonged in a museum. "I think this might be the strongest dinosaur I have ever seen." Lucas beamed so brightly that Ethan shook his head with an amused smile. Standing there in the middle of my still half-empty apartment, surrounded by unopened boxes and the scent of fresh coffee drifting in from the hallway, I realized something unexpected. I had moved there hoping for a fresh start, but without noticing, the apartment across the hall had already begun to feel like the first place that truly felt like home. The following Saturday morning, I was halfway through assembling a stubborn coffee table when 3 quick knocks echoed through my apartment. Before I could even reach the door, a familiar little voice called out, "Mr. Noah, it is me." I opened the door to find Lucas standing there in his rocket backpack, even though it was the weekend, holding a plastic container almost as big as his chest. Ethan stood behind him with an expression that mixed amusement and embarrassment. "Someone insisted that we bring you blueberry pancakes," he said. "He has been talking about your dinosaur compliment for 3 straight days." Lucas proudly held the container higher. I helped stir the batter. I smiled and accepted the gift as though it were the greatest surprise anyone had ever given me. "Then I know they are going to taste amazing." Lucas grinned so widely that I wondered if children simply carried sunshine inside them wherever they went. Ethan glanced toward the half-built furniture scattered across my living room. "Looks like you are losing another battle." I laughed. "This table has declared war. Do you mind if we help?" Ethan asked. Before I could answer, Lucas had already wandered inside, fascinated by the unopened boxes stacked against the wall. The next hour passed more quickly than I expected. Ethan assembled furniture with the confidence of someone who had done everything himself for years, while Lucas appointed himself my official helper, handing me screws that were usually the wrong size, but always delivered with absolute seriousness. Every few minutes he asked another question. Why did I move here? What was my favorite dinosaur? Did I like pancakes more than waffles? Did I know that turtles could live longer than people sometimes? His curiosity never seemed to run out. When the coffee table finally stood on its own 4 legs, Lucas clapped as though we had completed a masterpiece. Ethan shook his head with a quiet laugh. He celebrates everything. That is a good quality, I replied. Adults forget how to do that. Ethan looked at his son for a long moment before answering softly. I try not to let him lose it. There was something in the way he said those words that lingered with me. Later, The three of us sat on my apartment floor eating pancakes because I still had not unpacked my dining table. Lucas happily explained every crayon drawing he had made that week, including one where a purple dinosaur somehow became an astronaut. Ethan listened with complete attention, never pretending to be interested. He genuinely was. Every story mattered to him, no matter how small. Watching them together, I noticed details that most people probably missed. Ethan always cut Lucas's fruit into tiny pieces without thinking. He reminded him to drink water before Lucas even realized he was thirsty. Whenever Lucas laughed, Ethan instinctively smiled a second later, as though happiness echoed through him before he could stop it. There was no performance in his parenting, only quiet devotion. Before leaving, Lucas carefully taped his dinosaur drawing to my refrigerator with one of the magnets he had discovered in a kitchen drawer. "Now your apartment looks happier," he announced proudly. Ethan apologized for the decoration, but I shook my head. I think he is right. As they walked back across the hallway, Lucas suddenly turned around and waved with both hands. "Bye, Mr. Noah. See you tomorrow." Ethan looked almost ready to correct him before stopping himself. Instead, he smiled in a way that reached his eyes for the first time since we had met. "Only if you are not busy," he said. I watched them disappear into their apartment, and for the rest of the afternoon, I caught myself smiling every time I passed the refrigerator. The colorful dinosaur hanging there was only a child's drawing, but somehow it made the empty apartment feel warmer than all the furniture I had spent weeks choosing for it. By the time May settled into the neighborhood, seeing Ethan and Lucas had quietly become part of my daily routine. Some mornings we crossed paths in the hallway with coffee cups in our hands. Other evenings we ended up talking outside the building while Lucas searched for perfectly shaped rocks along the sidewalk, convinced each one belonged in his growing collection. None of it was planned, yet somehow our lives kept overlapping in the simplest ways. One rainy Tuesday, I arrived home earlier than usual and noticed Ethan's apartment door slightly open. I knocked softly before stepping closer. "Everything okay?" I asked. Ethan looked up from the kitchen with a tired smile. "Everything is fine. Lucas is finishing a drawing at the table. I just burned dinner." Sure enough, the unmistakable smell of overcooked pasta drifted through the apartment. I laughed. "That explains it." He rubbed the back of his neck, looking almost embarrassed. "Long day at work. I was answering emails while trying to cook. Apparently, I am not talented enough to do both." "Good thing I ordered too much takeout," I replied. "Would you let me rescue dinner?" 20 minutes later, the three of us sat around Ethan's small dining table eating grilled chicken, mashed potatoes, and vegetables from the neighborhood restaurant. Lucas happily announced that restaurant broccoli somehow tasted better than homemade broccoli, earning an exaggerated look of betrayal from his father. Their easy laughter filled the apartment in a way that felt surprisingly comforting. While Lucas excused himself to wash his hands before dessert, Ethan quietly stood to refill our glasses. That was when I noticed a framed wedding photograph sitting on a shelf near the living room. The frame faced the wall instead of the room. It looked intentional, not forgotten. Ethan followed my eyes and grew still for a moment. He walked over, gently picked up the frame, and turned it over in his hands without immediately looking at it. "Her name was Emily," he said softly. "Lucas's mom." His voice carried no bitterness, only the quiet weight of someone speaking about a chapter that had never truly ended. She loved thunderstorms. Every time it rained, she would make hot chocolate and insist that the weather sounded like music. He smiled faintly before looking down at the photograph. "Lucas still asks me sometimes if rain is his mom saying hello." I did not know what to say. Some moments did not need advice. They only needed someone willing to stay silent. Ethan carefully placed the picture back onto the shelf, still facing inward. "People tell you that time heals everything," he continued after a long pause. "What they do not tell you is that healing is not the same as forgetting. Some days I feel like I am doing better. Other days I catch myself reaching for my phone to tell her something funny Lucas said before I remember she cannot answer." His honesty settled quietly between us. There was nothing dramatic about it. No tears, no raised voices, just truth spoken without pretending to be stronger than it was. Lucas ran back into the room carrying another drawing, completely unaware that anything serious had been discussed. "Look," he said proudly. "I drew our building." I smiled as he handed me the paper. There were 2 apartments with bright yellow windows connected by an enormous rainbow stretching across the roof. 3 smiling stick figures stood outside. holding hands. Ethan looked at the picture, then at his son, and something unspoken passed across his face. As I walked back to my own apartment later that evening, I realized the greatest loneliness was not living alone. It was carrying memories that no one else could help you hold. And for the first time, I hoped Ethan would never have to carry all of his by himself. The weeks that followed slipped by so naturally that none of us seemed to notice when ordinary moments quietly became traditions. Every Sunday morning, Lucas knocked on my door carrying whatever new drawing he had finished that week. Every Wednesday evening, Ethan and I somehow ended up sharing dinner because one of us had cooked too much or ordered more food than either of us could finish alone. Even grocery shopping became easier when we happened to leave the building at the same time. Without discussing it, we had started making room for each other in our routines. One warm Saturday, Ethan suggested taking Lucas to the city park a few miles away. "You should come with us," he said while Lucas bounced excitedly beside him holding a soccer ball nearly half his size. He has already informed me that saying no is apparently not an option. Lucas nodded very seriously. Families go to the park together. Ethan and I exchanged an awkward glance before he smiled apologetically. He says things like that without realizing what they sound like. I smiled back. Maybe he just says what feels true. The drive lasted less than 15 minutes, but Lucas spent every second pointing out dogs, food trucks, and airplanes crossing the bright blue sky. At the park, he raced from the playground to the swings, and then to the soccer field with endless energy that neither Ethan nor I could hope to match. After nearly an hour of chasing him across the grass, we collapsed onto a picnic blanket while Lucas built an elaborate castle in the sandbox nearby. Ethan leaned back on his hands and laughed quietly. I forgot what it feels like to sit down. I thought parents developed unlimited energy. I joked. That is the biggest myth ever invented, he replied. Most days I am just trying to stay one step ahead of a 6-year-old who somehow wakes up completely recharged every morning. We watched Lucas proudly show another child how to decorate a sandcastle with tiny sticks and leaves instead of arguing over toys. He is a good kid, I said. Ethan's smile became softer. He teaches me every day that kindness is usually the easier choice if you slow down enough to see it. Later we wandered through the small farmer's market beside the park, where Lucas insisted everyone sample fresh peaches before buying any. The elderly woman running one of the fruit stands laughed as she handed him another slice. She looked at the three of us standing together and smiled warmly. "Your son has wonderful manners," she said. Before either Ethan or I could answer, Lucas happily declared, "I have 2 favorite grown-ups." The woman chuckled without asking another question, and Ethan and I simply looked at each other before laughing. Neither of us felt the need to explain. On the drive home, Lucas fell asleep in the back seat, clutching a small paper bag filled with peaches. Ethan lowered the radio until only soft music remained. "Thank you," he said quietly while keeping his eyes on the road. "For today, for all of this." I looked out the passenger window as neighborhoods drifted by in the afternoon sunlight. "I should be thanking you. I moved here thinking I needed a fresh start. I did not expect to find people who make coming home the best part of my day." Ethan did not answer immediately, but the gentle smile that appeared on his face lingered all the way back to the apartment building. As I carried the sleeping Lucas from the car while Ethan unlocked the front door, the little boy instinctively rested his head against my shoulder without waking. It was such a small gesture that most people would have forgotten it by morning, yet somehow it stayed with me, because for the first time in years, carrying someone else's happiness no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a privilege. Summer arrived with longer evenings and warm golden sunsets that painted the apartment building in soft shades of orange every night. Life settled into a rhythm that felt almost effortless. Lucas still knocked on my door whenever he wanted to show me a new drawing or ask impossible questions about dinosaurs and outer space. And Ethan and I had reached the point where silence between us was just as comfortable as conversation. That was why I noticed immediately when something changed. One Thursday evening, I returned from work expecting to hear Lucas laughing somewhere down the hallway, but instead I found a sleek silver sedan parked in the visitor space directly outside our building. A well-dressed man in his late 60s stood beside it speaking quietly with Ethan near the entrance. Even from a distance, I could tell the conversation was serious. Ethan's shoulders were tense, and the polite smile he wore never quite reached his eyes. I nodded as I walked past, but he only offered a brief wave before returning his attention to the older man. I did not ask questions. Everyone deserved private conversations. Still, I could not stop wondering why Ethan looked so unsettled afterward. Over the next week, the silver sedan appeared several more times. Sometimes the older man stayed only a few minutes. Other times he left carrying folders filled with paperwork. Lucas remained cheerful as always, but Ethan grew quieter. He smiled less. He seemed distracted during dinner, often staring at his untouched coffee long after it had gone cold. One evening, I brought over homemade chicken soup after noticing his apartment lights still on well past 10 o'clock. Ethan thanked me and invited me inside, but before we could sit down, someone knocked on the door. The older man stepped inside with another folder tucked beneath his arm. "I hope I am not interrupting," he said politely. Ethan introduced him as Richard Sullivan, Emily's father. Richard shook my hand warmly before turning back toward Ethan. "We can talk another time if this is not convenient." Ethan forced a reassuring smile. "No, it is fine. Give me just a few minutes." I stood to leave, not wanting to intrude, but Lucas ran over and wrapped his small arms around my waist. "Can Mr. Noah stay?" he asked hopefully. Ethan looked at me with an apologetic expression before gently kneeling beside his son. "Not tonight, buddy. We have some grown-up things to discuss." Lucas nodded, although disappointment was written clearly across his face. I quietly wished them a good evening and returned to my apartment. Through the thin hallway walls I could hear only muffled voices, never loud enough to understand. The next morning, Ethan looked more exhausted than I had ever seen him. Dark circles rested beneath his eyes, and even his usual gentle smile seemed difficult to find. As we walked Lucas to school together, I finally asked, "Is everything all right?" Ethan hesitated before answering. "I honestly do not know yet." After a long silence, he continued, "Emily's parents have always loved Lucas. They have every right to be part of his life, and I have never wanted to take that away from them." He looked down the sidewalk where Lucas skipped ahead, chasing a butterfly. "But lately they have been talking about whether he might have more opportunities living closer to them. Better schools, more family, a bigger house." He exhaled slowly. "I know they mean well, but every conversation leaves me wondering if I am somehow failing him." I stopped walking and looked directly at him. "You are the father who has been there every single morning and every single night. You are the one who knows exactly how he likes his pancakes and which bedtime story makes him laugh. A bigger house cannot replace that." Ethan held my gaze for several quiet seconds. His eyes glistened with gratitude, but also with fear that had clearly been building for weeks. Ahead of us, Lucas suddenly turned around, waved both arms, and shouted, "Come on. You are both too slow." Ethan smiled despite everything, and we followed him together, neither of us realizing that the hardest chapter of our story had only just begun. The conversation with Richard stayed in the back of my mind for days, but life refused to stop moving. Lucas still had school projects to finish. Ethan still worked long hours, and the apartment hallway still echoed with the familiar sound of little sneakers running from one door to the other every afternoon. Then, one Friday evening, everything slowed down at once. I had just finished answering emails when someone knocked hurriedly on my door. Ethan stood there with worry written across his face. "Lucas has a fever again," he said quietly. "The doctor says it is probably just a seasonal virus, but he wants him to rest through the weekend. I hate asking this after everything you have already done for us, but would you mind staying with him tomorrow morning while I attend a meeting that I absolutely cannot miss? I should only be gone for a couple of hours." "You never have to apologize for asking," I answered. "Go to your meeting. We will be fine." The next morning, Lucas was curled beneath his favorite dinosaur blanket on the couch, looking much smaller than usual. His normally endless energy had been replaced by sleepy eyes and a quiet voice. We spent the morning reading picture books, watching animated movies, and building a blanket fort that he insisted was secretly a castle. Every hour, I reminded him to drink water, and every time he made a face before finally taking another sip. "Daddy always says water helps superheroes get better," he mumbled. "Then we should definitely listen to your dad," I replied with a smile. Around lunchtime, he finally drifted into a peaceful nap. I covered him carefully with the blanket before quietly cleaning the kitchen. Less than an hour later, the front door opened. Ethan stepped inside looking completely exhausted, his tie loosened and his shoulders slumped with relief the moment he saw Lucas sleeping comfortably. "How is he?" he whispered. "Much better," I answered. "He even made me the official guard of his blanket castle." Ethan laughed softly, the sound carrying more gratitude than amusement. He walked over, gently brushed his hand across Lucas's forehead, and smiled when he felt the fever had started to break. "Thank you," he said, barely above a whisper. "Every time I think I have to carry everything by myself, you somehow appear before I even know I need help." I looked at him for a long moment before answering honestly. "Maybe you were never supposed to carry everything alone." The room became completely still. Outside, rain tapped gently against the windows just as it had the night we first met. Ethan slowly turned toward me, his eyes searching mine with an expression I had never seen before. There was no uncertainty anymore, only quiet understanding. "Noah," he said softly, "I do not know when it happened. Maybe it was the pancakes, or the park, or every ordinary day in between. I only know that somewhere along the way, coming home stopped meaning my apartment. It started meaning the people waiting inside it." My heart beat so loudly that I wondered if he could hear it. I smiled before answering because it was the only thing I trusted myself to do. "I know exactly what you mean." At that moment, Lucas stirred beneath his blanket, blinking sleepily before looking from Ethan to me. A slow smile spread across his face. "You are both smiling," he said happily. "I like when everybody smiles." Ethan reached for my hand without saying another word. His fingers rested gently against mine, offering a question instead of demanding an answer. I intertwined my fingers with his just as naturally as if they had always belonged there. Neither of us rushed the moment. Neither of us needed grand speeches. We simply stood together beside the little boy who had unknowingly brought two lonely lives into the same home. And for the first time since I had moved across that hallway, the future no longer felt uncertain. It felt like something already quietly waiting for us. Over the next few weeks, nothing about our daily lives looked dramatically different from the outside, yet everything felt different to me. Ethan and I never rushed to define what had quietly grown between us. We simply chose each other in 100 ordinary moments. We shared morning coffee before work while Lucas proudly packed his own lunch with careful supervision. We took evening walks through the neighborhood after dinner. We laughed over board games that Lucas insisted on changing the rules for whenever he started losing. It was peaceful in a way that neither of us had experienced for years. Then one afternoon, Ethan called me during my lunch break. His voice was calm, but I had learned to recognize the worry hidden beneath it. "Richard asked if we could meet tonight," he said. "He says he has made a decision." I met Ethan at his apartment after work. Lucas was spending the evening with a neighbor down the hall so the adults could talk without interruption. A few minutes later, Richard arrived carrying the same leather folder I had seen so many times before. He greeted both of us warmly before taking a slow breath. "I owe you an apology," he began. "For weeks, I convinced myself that giving Lucas a larger house and more financial security would automatically give him a better life." He looked directly at Ethan, but I finally realized I was measuring the wrong things. Ethan remained silent, waiting for him to continue. Richard smiled sadly. "Last weekend I asked Lucas what made him happiest. I expected him to talk about vacations or toys or the backyard at our house." His eyes became misty with emotion. Instead, he said his favorite place in the world is the hallway between these two apartments because that is where the people he loves the most always find each other. The room fell completely quiet. Richard continued. He did not describe a building. He described a family. Ethan lowered his head for a moment, unable to hide the emotion on his face. Richard reached across the table and gently placed a hand over Ethan's. "Emily trusted you with the most precious part of her life. I should have remembered that from the beginning. I am not here to take Lucas away. I am here to promise that I will support the life the two of you have built." Before Ethan could answer, Richard looked toward me with a gentle smile. "And from everything I have seen, it seems that life has become a little bigger than two people." I felt my face grow warm, unsure of what to say. Ethan glanced at me before quietly admitting, "It has." Richard nodded as though the answer brought him comfort instead of surprise. "Then do not waste time wondering whether you deserve happiness. Emily loved people who loved deeply. She would never want either of you to spend the rest of your lives alone because of guilt." After Richard left, neither Ethan nor I spoke for several minutes. We simply stood together near the apartment window as the evening sun settled over the parking lot where our story had unknowingly begun months earlier. Finally, Ethan turned toward me. For the longest time, I thought moving forward meant leaving part of my past behind, he said softly. Now I understand that love does not replace love. It simply makes room for more of it. I stepped closer until we were standing side by side. Then let us stop being afraid of the future, I answered. Ethan smiled with a quiet certainty that reached his eyes, and at that exact moment the apartment door opened as Lucas rushed inside, carrying a paper grocery bag filled with fresh peaches that Richard had bought on the way over. He looked from Ethan to me, then smiled with complete confidence. Good, he said happily. Everybody is home again. 1 year later, I unlocked my apartment door out of habit before remembering that I no longer needed to. The wall that had once separated my apartment from Ethan's had been replaced by a wide open doorway, turning two small homes into one place filled with laughter, coffee, scattered school books, and far too many dinosaur drawings. What had started as two neighbors living across a quiet hallway had become a family that never seemed to run out of reasons to smile. Saturday mornings were still Lucas's favorite. He would wake before either of us, tiptoe into the kitchen with complete confidence, and proudly announce that he was making breakfast. His version of cooking usually involved slightly uneven pancakes and far too many blueberries, but Ethan and I always declared them perfect. Some traditions were simply too precious to correct. After breakfast, we walked together to the neighborhood farmer's market, where nearly every vendor knew Lucas by name. The woman who sold peaches still slipped an extra one into his paper bag every week, smiling as she watched him chatter excitedly about school, soccer, and whatever new science fact he had learned. Richard visited often now, never as someone trying to change our lives, but simply as a grandfather who wanted to be present. Every visit ended with card games around the dining table and stories about Emily that filled the house with warmth instead of sadness. Her memory had become something we shared together instead of something Ethan carried alone. One afternoon, while Ethan and I assembled a new bookshelf for Lucas's growing collection of adventure novels, I noticed the old wedding photograph resting on the living room shelf. This time it faced the room instead of the wall. Beside it stood a newer picture taken during our picnic at the park. Ethan, Lucas, and I were laughing so hard that none of us had looked at the camera. The two photographs belonged together, not because one replaced the other, but because every chapter of a life deserved to be remembered with kindness. Ethan caught me looking and smiled. For a long time I thought I had to choose between honoring my past and embracing my future, he said quietly. Now I know that love never asks us to erase what came before. I slipped my hand into his, grateful that neither of us had been afraid to keep walking after life changed direction. Later that evening, as the sun settled beyond the apartment windows, Lucas ran into the living room holding another drawing. At 7 years old, his artistic skills had improved, but one thing never changed. Every picture still showed 3 smiling people together. Finished, he announced proudly before handing it to us. Ethan studied the drawing and laughed softly. Where should we hang this one? Lucas looked around very seriously before pointing toward the hallway that had once separated our homes. Right there, he said, because that is where everything started. Ethan and I looked at each other, both remembering the rainy night when a gentle knock at exactly 11:47 had quietly changed all of our lives forever. I helped Lucas tape the drawing onto the wall, and together we stepped back to admire it. It was only paper, crayons, and a child's imagination, yet somehow it captured something far greater than any photograph ever could. Home was never about square footage, perfect furniture, or even the place itself. Home was the people who waited for you at the end of every ordinary day, the hands that reached for yours without hesitation, and the quiet certainty that no matter what tomorrow might bring, none of you would ever have to face it alone. As evening settled over Maple Grove Apartments and warm light filled the rooms that had once belonged to 2 separate lives, I realized the greatest surprise had never been falling in love. It was discovering that sometimes the family you spend your whole life searching for has been living just across the hall, waiting for one simple knock on the door.